Okay, let's take a look at a little more specifically about social class, and there will be a future module about this, but we can lay some of the groundwork for that now. When we talk about this determination of social class, what is going to determine who is in what class, we can basically look at two major theoretical bases for these, and they come from two of the people we've discussed when we talked about the history of sociology, Karl Marx and Max Weber. And again, lending to an old theme that pretty much whatever Marx says, Weber's going to disagree with, and vice versa. We're going to see two very different ideas about what's going to cause people to belong to different social classes. And I said we'll expand on this and even modernize it to a certain degree in the next module. But for right now, we can just break it down and say when we talk about who determines or who decides who belongs in what class, for Marx, very basic distinction. Marx is all about a very famous phrase from sociology, the ownership of the means of production. So once again, thinking about Marx in the historical context in which he was doing his thinking and writing, this is shortly after the Industrial Revolution and during the time in which society is reeling from the changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution and mass manufacturing and production in society. Marx said basically that there's only two classes, and they are based solely on whether or not an individual owns some aspect of the means of production. So in an industrial society, the means of production are the tools, machinery, land, just capital and general money that's used to produce things in an industrial society. So anybody who owns large amounts of those things is said to own the means of production. So you would say the owner of a factory, or the owner of a shipyard, or a railway, or an oil production compound, that kind of thing. So those two classes, Marx basically said, were divided up into two, there were two classes. The bourgeoisie, and again, a modern slang term that comes from this, I often like to ask classes, what do you call it when somebody is acting or living above their means or acting kind of high and mighty, and most of us are familiar with the term bougie. That actually comes from this term bourgeoisie. So the term bourgeoisie refers to those people who own the means of production. So a more modern or simpler way of putting this would be the capitalists. The term Marx used was bourgeoisie. So they own the means of production. So if there's a factory and there's one person who owns the factory, then that person is bourgeois. Okay? And then the proletariat are those people who don't own the means of production. So their relationship to this idea of production is as workers, laborers. They sell their labor. So anybody at that factory who doesn't own it but contributes to its running is considered the proletariat. So in a sense, we can definitely say, according to Marx, you could have a situation, let's use a factory for example, in which basically there's one member of the bourgeois, that person who owns it, or maybe a small number of people, let's say if it's a family business or equal partners in it. But those people who own the factory are the bourgeoisie, and everyone else who works there is, according to Marx, proletariat. So two classes completely based on the ownership of the means of production. Marx predicted that sometime in the future, clearly we could see that in a society, if we just even looked at how this would divide society up, we can clearly see, and again this represents percentages of people, that B, again, stands for bourgeoisie, and P stands for proletariat. We would know in society that a very small group of people would own the means of production, whereas there'd be a much, much larger number of people who are simply workers. And what Marx predicted was that the proletariat at some time in the future will rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, recognizing that this is basically an unfair and exploitive relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, that the proletariat will rise up, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and create a more equal society. Again, that was taken in a political context to refer to communism, but again, subject for a different discussion. And what keeps that from happening, Marx called false class consciousness. Okay? So if we go back to the factory example and say that there's one person, let's say the factory employs 1,000 people, and it's owned by one person. So you'd have a situation where one person is the bourgeoisie who owns the factory. That person, and again, when we talk about ownership, we're talking about complete and utter control. So this is an influence. This person has the ability to run the factory. This person would have the ability to close the factory down if he or she wanted to, pick it up and move it, sell it, do whatever they want. So they have a proprietary kind of ownership of it. Whereas everybody else who works there is basically getting a wage or a salary for what they've done. But we clearly know, even when we think about a factory of 1,000 people, there would be pretty wide distinction between the types of workers at this factory. So assuming the ownership, the owner is not there all the time, or doesn't, even in a factory of 1,000 people, would probably need people there to run it on his or her behalf or assist in the running of it. And clearly those people would be a lot different than, let's say, the lowest earning worker in the factory. So let's say the janitor who cleans up at the end of the day, or the assembly line workers themselves. So the fact that there's this huge distinction between the people who we might call managers and workers contributes to what Marx called false class consciousness. The manager of a factory probably dresses in a suit and tie and has a salary which is many times greater than the average worker in the factory, and maybe owns a big home and drives to work in an expensive car and takes a couple weeks of vacation every year and goes to exotic locations, and his or her children attend very prestigious private schools. And that looks a lot different than the average worker who's working for minimum wage on the assembly line and is probably considered very poor. And Marx said that distinction between a managerial class and the workers creates false class consciousness. That if you were to ask the managers whether or not they consider themselves to be proletariat or bourgeoisie, they're much more likely to identify with the bourgeoisie, not only because of their wealth and distinction from the workers, but also because in some ways they kind of aspire to be or consider themselves part of that quote-unquote upper class, and wouldn't necessarily kind of throw their hat in the ring with the proletariat. So what Marx predicted was that one time in the future, all workers would become conscious of this exploitative relationship that the bourgeoisie has over the proletariat, even those who consider themselves, because of false class consciousness, to be part of the bourgeoisie and rise up and overthrow. In contrast to that, Weber, who, like I said, usually disagrees with Marx, does not base class distinction on ownership of means of production. Kind of his attitude about that was an oversimplification and didn't take into account what he considered to be the three components of social class. We've mentioned these already, the kind of three P's: property, power, and prestige. Property can be defined as wealth, okay, but basically anything that has a material value. And power is the ability to cause other people to do what you want them to do. Prestige is basically a measure of fame or just admiration within society, how much regard people give you. And Weber says that these three components are a better description of class. So if you just recognize that society, even if we take a very, like I said, oversimplified model and say that we only consider there to be three classes: upper, middle, lower, what Weber would say is that the upper class has the most property, power, and prestige. Middle classes have less, and the lower classes have the least amount of access to these things. So instead of Marx's kind of dichotomous relationship of the means of production, he's saying that this is a better description of class because it takes into account the fact that many people might not necessarily, what Marx would say, own the means of production, such as the factory managers that I was talking about, but the factory manager would feel that he has a significant amount of property, power, and prestige that would put him or her into the upper classes. So again, just a difference in these two basic concepts of what determines social class.